She lay under the bridge, trembling from the cold and pain, when footsteps echoed in the darkness. A beam of light illuminated her frail, dirty body, and a gentle voice whispered, "Hey, girl." Her heart froze. Was this salvation or a new threat? Beneath a massive concrete bridge that spanned a forgotten corner of the city, silent darkness stretched out. Its gray supports, cracked with age and overgrown with moss, loomed like the cold walls of a prison. No light reached here. Only the cutting wind, piercing the silence with its whistle, and the muffled sounds of cars racing overhead echoed like the voice of a world that had long forgotten those left below. In the most secluded corner, almost blending into the dirty ground, lay a German shepherd. Her body, once strong and graceful, was now but a shadow of its former self. Her fur, once shiny and smooth, was now matted and dirty, soaked through with dampness and streaked with blood from battles fought for survival. Her paws, which had once bounded effortlessly across soft grass, now throbbed with cracks that caused her unbearable pain, even when still. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, as if life itself was slipping from her body with every breath. Her ribs protruded sharply through her thin coat, and her shrunken, empty belly growled faintly with hunger. She had long forgotten the taste of food, the warmth of a home, or the touch of a kind hand. All she knew now was the cold, which seemed to seep into her very soul, and a loneliness more crushing than the concrete walls of the bridge. Deep in her mind, a memory of home still lingered. She had once been called Bella. That name had echoed in the voice of a woman who would embrace her, stroke her head, and laugh when her tail wagged with joy. In that home there had been laughter from children, a soft couch, and the smell of food wafting from the kitchen. She had been loved, or so she had thought. She remembered that road, narrow and winding, that led to the bridge. She remembered how her owner stopped the car, how her heart raced with the anticipation of a walk. She leapt out of the car, responding eagerly to the call, but instead of a joyful game, she was met with a cold, distant gaze. She didn't understand what was happening as he climbed back into the car and shut the door abruptly. Her paws scrambled to follow, her barking pierced the air, but the car only sped away, leaving her behind. Since then, her life had become an endless now. She hid beneath the bridge, where the wind became a merciless tormentor, gnawing at her frail body. She tried to shelter in a small hollow where the ground was slightly drier, but it offered little protection. Each night she curled into a tight ball to stay warm, but the cold found her even where her body pressed against the earth. When rain began to drum against the bridge, her shelter would flood, leaving her on the soaked ground, pressed against the concrete walls, praying for the night to pass quickly. Her paws could no longer run as they once had. They trembled as she ventured out in search of food. Nearby there were dumpsters in an alley, but reaching them required navigating a narrow path often crossed by other stray dogs. Once, when she dared to approach, a pack leapt out at her. She retreated, nearly stumbling, until she found refuge beneath her bridge. There, she licked her wounds, her frightened eyes watching every movement of her uninvited visitors. Every sound from above, the cars, the voices of people, reminded her of how far she was from the life that had once been hers. Her gaze had dulled. She no longer looked up at the sky or watched the sun that occasionally peeked through the cracks of the bridge. There was nothing left in this world for her. Only the bridge, only the cold earth beneath it. One night, when the wind was particularly cruel, she heard a howl. Somewhere far away, another dog was calling out. It was a low, mournful sound that resonated deep in her chest. She wanted to respond, but her voice had long since gone silent. She closed her eyes, letting tears stream down her face, mixing with the dirt and rain. In that moment, for the first time, she felt she could no longer fight. Her heart slowed and her body pressed closer to the cold ground, ready to become a part of it. But the bridge wasn't ready to let her go. The wind continued to tug at her fur, and somewhere in the darkness, footsteps echoed. She was too weak to lift her head. She could only hear the sound drawing nearer, breaking the stillness of the night. At the moment when her breathing was so faint it could barely be heard, the footsteps stopped, and the air was filled with something new, a scent she had given up hope of ever encountering again, the scent of a human. The night was pitch black, as if the sky itself had decided to smother the city with its darkness. Only the occasional flashes of light from passing cars broke the monotonous gloom, but under the bridge where the shepherd hid, that light never reached. There, impenetrable darkness reigned, deaf and unrelenting. In this void, she seemed even smaller, even more fragile than she truly was. It felt as though nature itself had abandoned her, leaving her alone with her fears. She lay curled up on the cold ground, her legs tucked tightly against her belly in a futile attempt to preserve some warmth. But it was useless. The cold pierced straight to her core, seeping into every cell of her weakened body. The wind, weaving through the bridge's supports, sliced at her skin like 1,000 invisible blades. She tried to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the bridge pressed in on her from all sides, as if the world itself had left her no way out. Her stomach was empty, so empty that every breath brought with it a pain that reminded her how long it had been since her last meal. Hunger was her constant companion, merciless and relentless. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now glimmered faintly, like two fading embers. They still scanned the space around her, searching for even the faintest chance of food, but with each passing day, hope grew dimmer. She knew she would have to leave her shelter. But every time she made that decision, her heart clenched with fear. She crept out from under the bridge, her movements slow and hesitant, as if every part of her body resisted the choice. The world outside was too vast, too dangerous. Her paws tread carefully on the damp earth, leaving barely visible tracks behind her. She made her way toward the garbage bins at the end of the street. There was always a faint scent of food lingering there, her only shred of hope. But those bins were far from safe. She knew that stray dogs or even humans could be found there, any of whom might harm her. But she had no other choice. Hunger drove her forward despite her fears. Her paws sank into the mud as she trudged toward the trash heaps. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her body, every muscle resisting as if nature itself tried to hold her back. She reached the bins, lifting her nose to catch the scent. But as she bent down to investigate, another dog suddenly sprang out from the shadows. A loud, guttural bark shattered the silence, and before her stood a gaunt figure, ready to defend its territory. Her heart froze. She knew she couldn't fight. She froze, lowering her head in submission, hoping the other dog would leave her be. But the intruder held its ground, baring its teeth in a clear warning. Slowly, she backed away, trembling with fear, until she turned and ran back toward her cold bridge. Her paws slipped in the mud, her breath came in ragged gasps. The other dog didn't pursue her, but the threat echoed in her mind long after she had escaped. When she returned to the bridge, her body felt even more drained. She collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily. Her paws were coated in mud, and her heart beat so fast it felt like it might give out. She stared into the darkness, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, though she refused to let them fall. She couldn't afford to show weakness. She lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, bracing herself for the possibility that danger might find her even here. That night, rain poured down in torrents. The drops hammered against the concrete, forming streams that began to seep under the bridge. Her shelter slowly filled with water, forcing her to rise. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she knew staying put would mean drowning. She dragged herself to the edge of the bridge, exposing her frail form to the relentless rain. The wind grew fiercer, cutting through her matted fur and making her shiver uncontrollably. She stood there, alone, under the downpour, like a figure carved from shadow and pain. Her eyes gazed out into the distance, but there was nothing there to comfort her. Only the distant lights of cars speeding by, indifferent to her existence. She lowered her head, her body hunched over. She felt small and lost in this vast, unforgiving world. The rain didn't let up, and she slowly returned to her spot under the bridge, where the water had nearly overtaken her shelter. She lay down once more on the wet ground, her body too weak to keep fighting. Her eyes began to close, heavy with exhaustion. She didn't know if she would wake up in the morning, but somewhere deep inside her, a tiny spark of life still clung to existence. What she didn't know was that someone was already on their way to her. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, too far for her to hear yet. Another night of suffering, another day of struggle. Her dance with darkness continued. Her body no longer obeyed her. She lay on the cold, damp ground, her nose pressed against her paws. Her frame trembled, whether from the cold or from exhaustion that had seeped into her very bones, she could not tell. The sounds around her were barely discernible. Only the dull patter of rain and the rare flashes of light from distant cars pierced the haze of her consciousness. But within her, there was nothing but silence. Too much silence, as though life itself had decided to abandon her. The wind beneath the bridge had turned into a howling gale, cutting into her emaciated body with cruel precision. The ground beneath her was soaked, water streaming in rivulets that transformed her shelter into an icy swamp. Every movement brought pain. Her paws were torn and battered, their pads cracked and bleeding, leaving faint red marks wherever she had tried to find refuge. Her eyes were half open, dull and lifeless, like coals that had long since gone cold. In their depths lingered only pain, a memory of betrayal, of days when her life had meaning. She no longer expected anyone to come. She no longer believed in anything. This bridge was her final refuge, a place where she could disappear, dissolve into the shadows without leaving a trace. But then, something changed. At first it was just a faint sound, soft, barely perceptible. Footsteps. Slow, cautious, as though someone feared disturbing the heavy silence. Her ears twitched, catching the vibration, but she didn't move. Her heart began to beat a little faster, not with hope, but with fear. The footsteps grew closer, clearer. Someone was coming toward her. Someone was out there, beyond the edge of her shelter. Her body tensed despite her weakness. Instinct screamed at her to run. But where? She had no strength left, no place to run to. She simply curled into a ball, pressing herself into the damp earth, hoping to remain unseen. The footsteps stopped. In the faint light she saw a shadow, a human silhouette. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes widened in alarm. The figure stood a short distance away, nearly blending into the darkness. He held a flashlight in one hand, its beam slicing through the gloom and skimming across the concrete walls of the bridge. The light landed on her small, trembling form, and she froze. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The man crouched slowly, deliberately, avoiding any sudden movements. The flashlight illuminated his face, and there was no trace of threat in it. On the contrary, there was something she hadn't seen in a long time. Gentleness, understanding. He extended a hand toward her, and her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't comprehend what he wanted. Every instinct told her it could be a trap.
Humans had betrayed her before. Why should this time be any different? "Hey, girl," he said softly, his voice low and gentle, almost a whisper. In his hand, she noticed a piece of bread. The smell hit her nose, triggering a painful growl in her empty stomach. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs, which normally carried her in desperate searches for food, felt as though they were anchored to the ground. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with fear and distrust. The man didn't move closer. He waited. His hand remained extended, his expression calm and kind. He spoke again, his words a soothing murmur she didn't understand. What she did understand was his tone, free of malice, carrying only an invitation. Her nose twitched, catching the scent of the bread. Hunger began to overpower her fear. Slowly, very slowly, she took her first step. Her legs trembled as if she were walking across a fragile sheet of ice, ready to shatter beneath her. Her body was low to the ground, poised to spring away at the slightest provocation. But the man didn't move. He simply waited, patient and still. Her heart raced wildly. She inched closer until her nose brushed his outstretched hand. The bread was real. Tentatively, she took it, ready to dart away at any moment. But he didn't try to stop her. She retreated a few steps, chewing the crumbs carefully, her wary eyes never leaving him. The man made no attempt to follow her. Instead, he sat down on the ground, his posture relaxed, showing her he meant no harm. In that fleeting moment, something shifted in her world. A moment so brief yet filled with something she couldn't fully understand. It was the first glimmer of light in the bleak shadows of her life. A tiny spark ignited in her heart. It was still too small to melt the ice encasing her soul, but it was there. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he was there. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone hadn't turned away. Someone hadn't chased her off. Her gaze, still heavy with pain and doubt, softened slightly. She couldn't have known that this meeting would change her life forever. She couldn't have known that behind the darkness surrounding her, there was a light capable of warming even her wounded spirit. Light streamed through the windows, filling the room with a soft golden glow. To her, this warmth felt almost unreal. She lay curled up tightly on the rug, as if shielding herself from the world, from her own memories. Her eyes, accustomed to darkness and cold, struggled to adjust to such a bright and unfamiliar space. She watched the sunlight glide across the floor, her body trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer strangeness of this new world. Everything felt foreign to her. Every movement, every sound made her flinch. The house, now her sanctuary, felt too spacious, too bright. There was no corner of shadow to hide in. But it was this place that had saved her from the abyss that had nearly swallowed her beneath the bridge. The man who had brought her here was patient. He didn't rush her, didn't overwhelm her. Each day he gave her space and time. He brought her food, always leaving it at a distance so as not to frighten her. He didn't try to pet her or approach too quickly. He simply stayed nearby, sitting on the floor, reading or speaking softly to her. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. It was her first encounter with a human who brought no pain. She ate slowly, cautiously, as though expecting it all to vanish like a fleeting dream. Each bite felt like it might be her last. Her once emaciated, frail body began to recover gradually, but her spirit remained fractured, her trust still a fragile thing. Each night, she curled up in a corner of the room, under the table or behind a chair, places that felt safe and hidden. Her dreams were restless, haunted by echoes of her past. She would wake suddenly, barking into the void, panting with fear. Sometimes the man would come closer, but he never intruded on her space. He would simply sit nearby, letting her know she wasn't alone.
Those nights were the hardest for her. The past clung to her, dragging her back to the betrayal and pain she had endured. Weeks passed before she took her first step toward him. One morning, when sunlight filled the room and he sat sipping a cup of tea, she approached. Her movements were hesitant, her steps almost soundless. She stopped a few feet away, her tail tucked low, her eyes full of uncertainty. But he didn't move. He only looked at her with the same gentleness he had shown the night they met under the bridge. She took another step, and then another, until her nose brushed against his outstretched hand. That moment changed everything. From that day forward, she began to trust. Slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably. Her tail, once still and lifeless, began to wag faintly when he came home. She started to follow him around the house, observing his every move. She still retreated to her corner when loud noises startled her, but she no longer bolted at every sudden sound. One day he took her outside for a walk. Her paws, now stronger, stepped gingerly onto the soft grass of a nearby park. Her eyes darted around, still scanning for threats. She saw other dogs playing joyfully, their carefree movements foreign to her. Then one of them approached her, sniffing curiously. She froze but didn't back away. It was the first time she didn't tremble at another's presence. Her new life began to unfold, but her scars remained. There were still days when she would freeze, overwhelmed by a sudden memory of the cold under the bridge. Nights when her gaze, filled with pain, seemed to drift far away, back to the shadows of her past. The man understood. He knew she couldn't be completely healed, that her wounds would always be a part of her, but he also knew she was no longer alone. Over time, her coat regained its luster, and her body grew strong again. She learned to trust not just the man, but the world around her. Her eyes, once dull and hollow, softened, though they still carried the quiet weight of her past. One day, the man brought her back to the bridge. They stopped at the edge, looking out at the grim structure that had once been her prison. She walked to the edge, pausing as if remembering. Her gaze swept across the shadows, but this time she didn't feel fear. She turned back to the man, her eyes shining with gratitude. She knew the bridge no longer held her captive. Her home was with him now. Her soul no longer wandered alone. The scars of her past remained, but her story had become something more, a light for others who had seen her struggle. She was no longer just a dog forgotten beneath a bridge. She had become a symbol of resilience, hope, and the transformative power of love, which could heal even the deepest wounds.